So we're going to start with Angie Stallings, Deputy Superintendent of Policy, and go ahead to our legislative overview.
Just making sure.
Good afternoon. Angie Stallings, Deputy Superintendent of Policy, and I'm joined at the table by Deputy Superintendent Scott Jones. And we're going to be here and available to answer any questions you have or provide additional information and support your discussion of the 2023 legislative session. Yesterday, we sent this quick guide that Kelsey's showing on screen right now, which is a high-level overview of the top funding and policy or bills from the session. This overview hopefully is a good resource for you to use as well, as you may have constituents or others who ask you to share highlights of what happened this session. This quick guide is uploaded and available on Civic Clerk as well for the information of members of the public. And so at this point, Deputy Jones and I weren't necessarily planning on doing an overview, because in some ways you might think, well, we just lived that session, Angie, and we met with you every week during the session, so we didn't want to cover any information or be redundant. So we're happy to take direction on what you would like us to cover, if anything, and then also happy to answer any questions about either the financial side. And there's also, I should note that Deputy Jones and his staff have prepared a comparison chart with line items and information that's also available in Civic Clerk with more detailed information on the appropriations that came from the legislature. So with that, Chair, we are ready to follow the board's lead and support in any way we can.
Okay, I'm back. Sorry, I had to grab a cord. Questions, comments? Member Boggess?
I don't think I was first, Chair, but I'm happy to go first.
Oh, let me get back into my line here. I apologize. I got more lights
I'm
than I'm
happy
not
to wait,
seeing.
sir.
We got Member Booth, Member Vice Chair Hart, and Member Boggess.
All right. My question is, what do you see as the most significant fallout that will require man-hours and resources, and as you look at the entire session and everything that's been passed, where are we going to need to focus as an agency as we move now into implementing what's now the law?
Wow, that is a loaded question, and I don't know if you want to share your side, and I have some ideas of things that we're going to need to work on as a board. Do you want me to go first? You want to go first?
I can just real quick. So Chair, just for Board Member Booth's question, I think, as we all know, there was a lot of discussion on the constitutional amendment. I wouldn't say it really came down to the wire, but, we're going to track that. We still have one more session before it goes on the ballot. So I don't see a lot of man hours per se going into that, but we definitely need to ensure that, we'll be going around to the different USBA meetings. In fact, I'm going to one tonight in the Ogden area, get the feedback from the field. On that particular, I think that was a momentous piece as far as it affects funding. I'll stay in the funding lane with that, and then Chair, go to Deputy Stallings for more insight on the bills and legislation. I think so, but the funding side of it is that amendment. I think so.
Yeah, I think from the bills side, I know that I heard from just the principal of my kids' own school, so my kids are still in elementary, and they are already talking about the rollout of full day K. So I think that from the district and charter school perspective is something that they're going to be working on, and maybe a bit of a lift in the sense of finding teachers and making space. I know that in my own elementary school where my kids go, they are going to go to 100% full day K classrooms at that school, for example. And so that's one lift that I think the whole state will be supporting and working on. Some of the things that I think you'll be able to look forward to as we haven't counted all of the rules that are required yet. We've got a list that has started. We had our implementation meeting on Tuesday, but that still needs some refinement. But a couple of the bills that I could see LEAs looking to the board for more support and clarification on are HB 348, in the sense that a lot of the language is somewhat vague or open. And so I could see LEAs requesting some clarification or guidance and support through the rulemaking that is required as a part of HB 348, as well as potentially support on clarifications related to HB 427. I was just, and part of the reason why I touched on those first is because they were closer on the quick guide. I'm imagining as well that another lift will be supporting all of the school safety bills from this session. And I can see there's a lot of changes with respect to creating reintegration plans, for example, as part of, I'm trying to remember, I think that was HB 304, where before a student comes back into schools, now the schools will be working on reintegration plans for minors who've committed a felony or alleged to have committed a felony offense. And that's mostly it. We'll have a bit of a lift as well with some of the requirements related to the statewide online education program and a new license related to online providers. That will be something I think the board can look forward to tackling as well.
Other questions?
Can I do a follow-up question?
Member Hart, oh, yes.
Is there anything that, as you've interacted during the session with USBA or with Lexi and the gang, or UEA, that really jumps out as something that they're concerned about already out in the field, that you mentioned that we might need to, provide them some support on HB 304 or 427? Is there anything that's kind of like what they're all talking about, that, oh gosh, how are we going to do this?
I think in general, since the session just barely ended, a lot of times there's a feeling of sense of overwhelming, right? Of how are we going to get all of this done? I will say that yesterday, when we met with superintendents and a couple of charter folks about the rules, a request was made that if there is any way possible that as LEAs are required to update policies or create new policies, if there's any way the board could provide more time for those policies to be created, that would be helpful. Now, the hard part with that is if we don't implement and get policies in place soon, the legislature may assume that nothing is happening, and then we don't have results to show before the next session. So there's always that balancing act of, Deputy Jones says slow is smooth, smooth is fast. And I think LEAs often want to take time to make sure that their policies are in a good place, which of course oftentimes means that the board has to get our rulemaking done so that then they work on the policies. I think that's just a difficult place we're always in, where it takes more time than everybody wants, especially policymakers. It takes more time to implement well. If we don't do it quick enough, then people will jump to make changes again next session. I think you could see that with sensitive materials, for example. Those policies and some of the reports didn't start coming in till November, and the session started in January. So I think that was an overarching support us as we implement to have the time sufficient to do quality work, is what I heard.
Good, thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Member Hart, then Bogus, and then Lear.
Yeah, my question is is really nuts and bolts. Can you outline for us what we could expect as far as timeframe, the look ahead? Will we have? Is there going to be some sort of document of when we're going to rule make around? Like, is there a chart or a timetable, or what can we do? And this is a related question. What can we do to best prepare for board meetings where we are doing that rulemaking? Are there some look-aheads that we could plan for? Just the time frame and the structure of how we go about doing this. It's like childbirth. I think I forgot it the last time around.
Yeah.
And I'm just needing a refresher in order to be prepared.
Yes, that's a great question. And Kelsey, I just forwarded you a document that's from last session that we'll be working on. It takes a little bit of time, and the session just ended last week. But by your April meeting, and great, thank you, Kelsey, for showing that. You may remember we prepared this implementation summary, which shows the rules that we're anticipating needing to either amend or enact related to certain bills, new programs, RFPs, reports, et cetera. You can see that we plan to create a version of this document again for the board. And that will be by your April meeting.
Thank you. And that was not to indicate that it should have already happened. I just wanted to start preparing
Yeah.
for this.
Okay, Member Bogus and Member Lear.
Okay, Chair, I think I have, excuse me, I think I have 3 questions. Hopefully, they're all germane. Angie, sorry, I apologize, Superintendent Stallings. SB 35, as I read that, I get a little bit of consternation about what I would call state sovereignty in our education system. When we enter into agreements like that and then we legislate it, and then we have to meet certain standards to continue to remain eligible for an interstate compact. To me, we're like rubbing up against the 10th Amendment to the United States Constitution, and I'm wondering, have we sacrificed our sovereignty and our autonomy in exchange for reciprocity?
A pretty big question. I'm not sure if it's an action item question, or let's try to stick to recap, and some of these might suggest further action we want to take as a board, but Superintendent Dixon's got a response.
Yeah, thank you, Chair Moss. Board Member Bogus, I'm happy to drill down on this with you since I worked on this directly with
Okay.
Representative Moss and was part of the National Advisory Committee on the compact. So we don't give up anything in terms of how you represent licensure. You make the rules around licensure, but it just allows for anybody who, there are criteria within the bill that are laid out. So successful teaching for a certain amount of time, licensure in good standing in another state. So instead of moving to our state and having to reapply and go through a lot of bureaucracy, that we would accept their license as a Utah license. And then there's employment. So, those two are very separate things, but we do not give up any sovereignty, if you will, over licensure. It's just accepting somebody who's already licensed from another state that's been, had success as a teacher. And this is the same for compacts that we have. And you have to have, I think, 10 to 12 other states in the compact in order to participate. So it wouldn't be from every state, it would be just those who have signed on to the compact.
Okay, thank you.
Does that help?
Yeah.
And I'm happy to answer
I did
more
read the
finite
bill, but
details.
I was like, yeah,
Further,
okay.
Member Lear or Member Bogus, do we have
I
I will, let's just try to keep to recap, and some of these might suggest further action and debate, but we are getting
okay,
behind again.
I'll be smoking fast. Does
Perfect.
HB 209 address the issues that are already in place? And who rule makes on that? Is it us? Is it the High School Activities Association? And I'm assuming it's us, but there's ongoing issues in LEAs when we're crossing boundary lines, and I'm not seeing in that piece of legislation, maybe you can help me understand, if we're addressing the problems that we are already experiencing that were not addressed in the bill. Thank you, ma'am.
Yes. So we do not we do have one rule or two that relate to the High School Activities Association, but they govern LEAs directly, and but then conditions say if you're a member of an association, the association needs to do ABC. I would see that this bill, actually, most of the heavy lifting, if not all the heavy lifting, will be done by the High School Activities Association. And what I heard in testimony, and I'll be honest that because I knew that this was really the High School Activities Association load to carry and duty. I didn't focus on the particulars as much, but in a lot of ways, they stated in their testimony that this codifies a lot of what already is practice about once you have this right of first entry, and whenever you enroll and start participating, that's your first school. And that, so it doesn't matter where you live, as long as you enter, that's your first entry. Now, if they transfer after that, that's when you start to get into some of these issues about your residency, and or if something caused you, like the bullying incident caused you to want to move. And then you get a waiver or have to go through that process. But yeah, I don't see the State Board of Education needing to do a rule on this at all, because the high school activities, Utah High School Activities Association has fairly robust provisions already on this, and I didn't hear them saying that it would change their practice much at all.
All right, I think I got it out of line here. I've got Member Booth and then Member Lear.
Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot.
Oh, Member Lear.
Thanks, and I'm similar to Christine. I have a few questions that I think are pretty quick. First of all, I would request and this maybe is to Chair Moss, and I think Brent was on this Rules and Requirement Task Force that you folks were working on right through the session. I've just started, for my own satisfaction, going through all the bills and writing down all the new requirements that are in these bills for both USBE and LEAs. I would really plead with you, if you continue that work, that would be great. But I think the best place to to sort of at least beg them to consider these concerns is not the back end, where you guys have been working, but the front end. Because I've already been through, I've only been through about 5 bills, and I've got about 7 or 8 requirements for both USBE and LEAs. So if they are sincere about this, they meaning legislators, then let's call it to their attention right now, and I would love to have the USBE on every bill point out the new requirements, like a fiscal note for LEAs and USBE. So that's more of a comment than a question.
I'll just say amen.
But then let's do it, because,
And I'll come back to that, because we almost did this session. I'll report a bit later
Okay.
on efforts to actually get to that didn't quite make it to the finish line.
thank you.
but-
I really hope so. First of all, and then also in response to your 348 discussion, the board had a rule on the exact issues that we're now being told to write a rule about. So you can just go back to that rule and resurrect it and say, oh, we have this and you told us to repeal it. So that's a thought. This is to Scott, well, I think to Scott. The 6% WPU increase and then the attached bribe that said you'll get 2% more if somehow the earmark passes. Is that still, I didn't find it anywhere in writing. Is that just a promise that we have, or what?
So it is funded.
It's literally funded.
Yeah, Chair, it's about 19 million, 2%, or no, I'm sorry, more than that, about 80 million, 79 million with it. So by virtue of that, then it's there. There's intent language. I think it was in well, I'll have to check which bill it is, but I'll get you the intent language. The
Okay.
intent language is in a bill.
That's helpful to
It
know.
is.
I'm
I'll
glad
send
about
it to
that.
you.
It was
Yeah.
in Peterson's bill, 494 maybe?
No, I think it was I think it was in one of it might have been in SB2.
That's fine. If you
Can't
can,
remember.
I
I'll send it
looked
to you.
through
I'll
SB2
make
and
sure.
didn't find
Yeah,
it,
let me
but-
double check.
And
But there
sec-
is intent language.
Oh,
Yeah.
good. Okay, I'm glad to hear that. On the bottom of the quick guide page, which I found really, really helpful, thank you. And I know that was a huge effort so soon after the session ended. Notable education stabilization funding, and Scott, I think I've asked you this before, but that's their sort of more fancy language for rainy day fund, is it not? Am I right about that?
Well, so Chair, to answer that question, the minimum school program comes out of the Education Stabilization Fund. So and then there's, the tie into the Uniform School Fund. So yes, I mean, there's tie-ins to stabilization of public education funding with that. But I can show our intent is to map this, so to speak, so that we can provide a visual of where the money goes in the interest of making sure to do that. We just didn't quite get there yet. So I just asked for, give us till April, and I can map that for you.
That's super fine.
So,
I just
sure.
am trying, after all these years, to still understand the
Sure.
funds that
Yes,
that monies come from. And it doesn't help me that they keep changing the names, but.
Right.
Anyway, last question. Looking on the second page of that notable funding highlights, Scott, and it says student credential account statewide usage, 3.5 mil. What in the Sam Hill does that mean?
Yes, and I think I probably need to send it to you offline, right?
Okay.
Because while I know about the money and the funding for that, there's a good summary of student credentialing in the COBE. In fact, I sent it to Superintendent Dixon, who had a similar question, but it's quite lengthy. So let me send that, I'll send it to the whole board, so everybody's familiar with that.
Okay. Thank you very
too.
much.
Yeah, let me send that to the whole board.
I'd like to understand what
Yes,
those words.
yes, ma'am. I think it would, it's a value add, Chair, for the whole board if I send that to the whole board. So you have what the definition of all that and what the program's designed to do. So,
Thank you.
yes, ma'am.
All right, thank you. We've got, let's see, what other lights do we have? Member Straight? No, Member Bogus and then Member Straight.
Thank you, Chair. So Mr. Superintendent Jones, I have a question about the hold harmless bill. And I understand the minimum school program, and so I want to maybe provide a tiny bit of context. But the hold harmless bill, as I understand it, it holds districts harmless from decreases in enrollment. Is that a fair, just truncated version?
Yes, that's fair.
Okay,
Yeah.
so in 2020, one of our school districts in this state lost about 1,700 kids, and that's right at or about $6.85 million in hold harmless. And the Salt Lake City School District has decreased in students over the last few years. During what we would call the COVID crisis, I think they lost about 3,000 students. I could be wrong on that number, but that would be
That
at or
sounds
about
right.
$12 million. And this is a 10-year hold harmless bill. At what point are we double funding kids in massive proportions and bleeding our taxpayers? And don't get me wrong,
Yeah.
I think that we need to acknowledge that the chemistry teacher for 9 is the same as the chemistry teacher for 40.
Sure.
Right? But at what point do we acknowledge that maybe this might not be prudent fiscal policy?
So, Chair, one thing I
I
want to
wanna
clarify
clarify
or
on
make
that.
sure that I don't get, is over time, we will still continue, well, if, when the October 1 counts come in, because that's the big look, right, at enrollment counts. Individual LEAs will have to continue to adjust those, right? But there is this capability now by virtue of this hold harmless, so that if there's, a precipitous decline in enrollment or things like that, that it do. So I want to be clear that by no means whatsoever does this mean that no one will lose money, right? There will still be adjustments on individual LEA basis, and because in a lot of cases, if an LEA loses students, another one gains, right? I mean, I get it, there's migration out of the state too, there's graduation, those things too, but typically, there's migration from district to district, or district to charter school, or charter school back into district. So I want to be clear that there still will be adjustments made based on those October 1 enrollment counts, okay? So what I think would probably benefit, without getting into too much detail, is that mapping too. And an example, like, enrollment, we see an enrollment decline in A, and gains in B, so that all of you can benefit from that question, right? I don't have the visual prepared for that, but we can certainly do that as staff, so, as a follow-up to you, so, yeah. Okay, yep.
Thank you, Deputy Jones. And just point of clarification, the hold harmless is really across the system, where the
Yep, across the state.
overall amount that would otherwise not be funded because of declining enrollment, that amount will be reinvested into the value of the WPU, which will then be subject to apportionment based on enrollment with mid-year adjustments. So that was part of the discussion. It's a little bit different form of hold harmless, and it basically builds in that decline into that WPU, which then if enrollment increases, it's baked in. That was the discussion and sort of some last minute changes to the bill, so.
Right, and
members,
that's why we have to emphasize, Chair, if I may, that's why we have to emphasize that there is still some misunderstanding out there that the hold harmless means that if they lose enrollment, they won't get an adjustment, right? That's not necessarily true, right? I mean, we need to make sure that we cover all those aspects in it as well. But he's right, that's, it's not the tip. I would say that's fair to say that it's not what we're used to as the definition of hold harmless as it's been applied in the past.
It's kind of a systemic hold harmless,
Yeah.
which also has the effect
More of a
of.
statewide application, but you'll see changes on an individual LEA basis, though, so, yeah.
Member, yeah, ma'am. Member Straight.
Thank you, Chair. I'll try not to get too far in the weeds. One of the things that I have observed over the last couple of years in this position is the legislature has their interim period. I think perhaps we ought to look at what we're doing in the interim, what policies we as a board could help put in place that would be good for education and be good for the legislature as well. I've heard some states, you cannot turn in an education bill after the third week of the session, or they only do education bills every other year. I'm not getting into what I think we should do, but I think we as a whole board should be doing something along the lines of what we're doing in the interim, what policies we'd like to put in place. The other issue, or other thing, came from when we were visiting with the Speaker of the House. We talked briefly about the idea of having some type of legislative review where the board would offer to look at a bill and say, well, we have this rule already. We've already seen some examples of that in this session where 427, for example, a lot of that is already in rule. And perhaps a little more coordination, a little more collaboration and cooperation, we could actually help guide and direct good legislation by being a part of that process. And I don't know what that would look like, and I don't think it's a discussion for today, but those are a couple thoughts I've had that I'd really like us to become a little more proactive in our approach to the legislative session.
And let me just respond to that, because I think that plays into something we've already been talking about. Our first, one of our first pitches when we as leadership went up to the Hill is we would like to help reduce the number of education bills by addressing the concerns that animate those bills and doing it in our house so that you don't have to, and so that we have the opportunity to take sort of the driver's seat. And Speaker Wilson, I think you were there, Member Straight, Speaker Wilson was very, and I've had other discussions with leadership about the idea of the state board convening some meetings, and we've been discussing that among leadership, a good way to do that we might, again, I think take the driver's seat in some of this and figure out, what's out there, what's already in place, what's the problem, what do we know about the problem, whose lane is it fall into to address the problem. And there's some, basic separation of powers kind of stuff where we have a 45-day scramble and things move pretty quickly, but, I've had precisely those types of questions with legislative leadership, and I think they're supportive of that, and it would give us a chance to maybe break it down by a few subjects on which a lot of bills tend to pop up and say, look, here's what we're already doing, here's what maybe LEAs would like to do, here's what the state board can do. If there's a bill necessary, how can we weigh in and help shape that? And we do a lot of that. Our staff does a lot of that. Some of the bills that sort of come in, maybe not in prior consultation with staff, are those that are hardest to kind of adjust to. But I think the proactive approach is exactly where we've been talking as leadership, and again, had some positive feedback from the legislature, which really appreciate. So we'll, like you said, that's not for today, but we've been talking about setting up those meetings and should have something to present or discuss in April. So appreciate that. And again, I think thanks to the legislature for saying we'd like to see you in the driver's seat on some of these issues. So we will certainly follow up. Any other, I see Member Davis and Member Lear.
Yeah, thanks. Some of us, a handful of us, went to the JLC legislative follow-up last night and just listened to their thoughts. And they learned from this past session, and I would say arguably, to me, it was the most frustrating I've seen in 30 years. But they are going to, or discussed, having somewhat of like an interim of their own and getting more proactive and, instead of being so reactive like we've all been the last 45 days, getting proactive on the front end. And I really think we need to do more of that, not so that we can make more rules to make lots of people happy, but we can think through things and streamline and combine and figure out where we already have what, just as Chair Moss said. 299 bill files introduced this year that all would impact education. I mean, they all didn't pass, but over 100 passed, and it's too many. And we could maybe look in the interim at asking for a bill to limit education bills or something of that nature. But I have a question about one bill that people are bringing up to me and that was mentioned to me in JLC, that people are frustrated and concerned about the real nebulous, unclear language about how to implement, is it 342 Acton's bill? 348, thank you. I'm always getting the numbers wrong. Yeah, thank you. So I guess, we've always had this situation where in the secondary schools, students could, be dismissed or something if there's a concern, but I guess it pushes down into the lower grades now, and it's not clear from what some were saying that, if you have 7th, 6th graders that go out, then who supervises and what does it mean the teacher promptly contacts the parents that the kids had a right of conscious moment, and right of conscious isn't necessarily, I don't think, defined in the law, even though school is defined. I mean, it's like, who wrote that? I mean, it's like people who don't know what it's like to teach 40 kids at a time and keep all their attention and stop in the middle and contact parents. Is that kind of the expectation of this, really? And what responsibility do we have as board members? Are we supposed to write rule to help make this in some way manageable?
I think that is the expectation, that the state board is going to come up with provisions and guidance to make it more manageable. And I mean, as staff, I know we were discussing that bill and that heavy burden of that expectation coming from some to somehow make HB 348 clearer or easier to implement for teachers and administrators. And of course, I think the staff at USBE as well as the board, that is what we all want, right? Is to help support LEAs in their implementation. I will say that we were reviewing and referring to the differences between HB 348 and a provision that's already in our 277-700, which is the graduation requirements. Board rule in there already, parents and students do have the right to request a substitute or alternate course requirement, including extracurricular activity or experience. And there, it doesn't say if it's because of religion or right of conscience. It just says you have a right to have something, an alternate.
Substitute.
It does say that an experience that is similar to the course requirement or consistent with the student's plan for college and career readiness. And we were just talking about how in some ways making this all conditioned on either a religious or right of conscience is going to be something that teachers and administrators might need some training on or support on how to do that, versus in 700, it just says you have the right to an accommodate, an alternate substitute experience, regardless of the reason.
Which is how it should have.
And there's some question about what it means to penalize versus, the rule again does state that there is an expectation that there may be an experience. So we'll present all of this, our 277-700, and maybe ask our administrators and educators what their practice has been, because the rule also said that LEA should have a policy on this, and there might be some things we can learn from that could help inform your rulemaking when we come to Representative Acton's. But I have had a couple of people worried about how to interpret right of conscience, and so the question will be whether the board will want to define it. It doesn't explicitly say that the board shall define right of conscience, it does say the board shall create rule. So as we work through the rulemaking with you all, those are decisions that you'll make, is whether we want to create a definition, we want to leave that to the LEA to determine what that might be, and we'll work through that with you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Let's see. We have Member Lear. Superintendent Dixon, are you back on? Did you want to weigh in?
I'll defer to Board Member Lear if she wants to speak about the same bill. I just wanted to riff off something that Board Member Davis said.
Member Lear?
And I just had two quick things I forgot. One is I hope in our, I've observed over the years that I think the most helpful thing we can do for LEAs is provide them model policies. And it looks like that's one of the things that they have to, that is coming up over and over. Create a policy, create a policy, create a policy. I know USBA does that also, but I think that would be something that we could really be helpful in, and not just repeating the rule in a policy, but literally creating a template that they can insert information into, they LEAs. Secondly, to Chair Moss's point about having more conversations with legislators up front and trying to help them understand that we can do this work. I hope we can have a study session about that, because one of my frustrations in watching this session more than any others has been that I thought that's what the board leadership were doing, only to find out that individual board members were working on maybe even initiating rule or bills that confuse legislators that I talked to. Well, I thought you wanted fewer bills, and now all of a sudden there's this bill. Oh, I'd never heard of that bill. So I would hope that maybe we could have a very frank conversation about how those bills come about and who's on first, sort of.
Yeah, we should have that, and leadership did reach out early on about discussing with legislative leadership. Individual members also participate in their own capacity, and that's
And I
part
just
of the
think
process.
Then we ought to know, because, hey, I've got lots of good ideas for legislative bills. And I think that if it's going to be a free-for-all, then let's just do it. If we're going to work as a body and keep the numbers down, let's do that.
That would be a good study session
Thank you.
topic. Let's do that as we roll into those forums that bring us together with legislators and LEAs. Let's see. Superintendent Dixon, sorry. Back to you.
Thank you, Chair Moss. I just want to add, and that you may have had the same experience. I had a couple of legislators approach me and say, and they were freshman legislators who said, I just am surprised and feel very overwhelmed by the number of education bills. And if the board wants to use me in the future to remove things that are in code or run bills to eliminate bills or limit bills, so we have people that are ready to do that, should you decide to go in that direction. And I thought that was an interesting comment. And they voted in a number of different ways on education bills that came through. So, in the majority party, just recognizing that we felt very overwhelmed by the number of bills that came through, and they want to help. So I'll just put that out there, leave it in the air when you meet again to have this discussion.
All right, anything further on legislative review? Okay, thank you for, anything final from Deputy Jones?
No, other than, Chair Moss, just some further clarification, as it relates to so it's SB 3 that the intent language is in on the 2%, but I'll email it to everybody, so sorry I didn't remember the bill number off the top of my head. But I'll send you the line numbers in the legislative intent. And then on the economic stabilization account, I just want to make sure that I was clear that it's in the Uniform School Fund, right? I think I said MSP comes out of the economic stabilization account, but both MSP and the economic stabilization account are in the Uniform School Fund. So I just want to make sure you know that, so that when I send you the visuals, we start at the top, right? With the fund itself and then the parts of it, and then, yes, yeah. So that's what we're going to do. Okay, so yeah, I just want to clarify that. Okay, thank you.
All right, Member Reel.
I wanted to make kind of a picture comment about the legislative session this year, and this is something that they said last night at the USBA meeting, and that's that, you know, I care a lot about local control, and I try to fight for it a lot, but it's wild to me to see legislators not talking to their local school boards, not talking to their state board of education rep, and without any consultation running some of these bills. And so last night they mentioned that and talked about how important it was to reach out to our legislators and be in touch with them and know that if a constituent does come to them with some concerns or some issues that they'd like to see them run a bill, that they talk to their local board or their Utah State Board member first, or send them to us in that way. And I think that oftentimes we forget about how important local control is, because as I tell my students, that they're the closest to the community and they're best at serving and implementing policies for them. And so I think that's one thing that I've learned mostly from this, is that how important it is to work with our representatives and to make sure that we're engaged with them so they can use us as a resource and send their constituents to us as well.
Great point, thank you. And Member Earl, Vice Chair.
Yeah, I do think it's important that we notice what did bubble up during the session. I think we ought to intuitively be asking, why are those bubbling up? And I guess we could say, well, they didn't go to their local district. I don't know that that's necessarily the case. I think that that sometimes they have approached their local district and either parents or constituents did not receive, and right or wrong, they didn't receive the feedback that they were interested in or still had concerns that were rising. I think for us that there is an element of looking at what did come to the surface this session and say, why is that surfacing? And then be able to look at that and say, how can we better address this moving forward? I think it is part of the broader dialogue, instead of just saying, well, they just didn't go to the right people. And I'm not putting that's not what I'm saying, because we should be, right? That's where people should be coming, but sometimes that tool is not always easily accessible or workable. So I do think we need to be asking, why were there so many sensitive material items coming up? Why were there so many, we had it in 257, there were like 4 or 5 issues that were in there that we didn't know exactly where those came from, but someone somewhere had some kind of a concern that they had, and yet we didn't necessarily know the exact situation. So I do think there's a need to look at those and say, what came to the surface and why was it sitting there? And is there a need to kind of look at those internal controls or those internal things going on and make sure that we're addressing things as we need to, so they can be addressed earlier and maybe not even have the same situation come up next year.
Thank you, Vice Chair Earl. And again, I think we can play a facilitative role there as the state board. We're parked between the legislature and the field, and we can lead out in helping to clarify what concerns are animating legislation and how we can maybe facilitate getting those addressed at the appropriate level. And sometimes there's coordination, and sometimes it's just getting something solved at the local level. And so thank you, Deputy Jones and Deputy Stallings.